Welcome to week 5. This week we're focusing in on a few topics, basically updates to the 1938 Act from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDCA. One of these changes will have impacts for the USDA. The other will be solely and exclusively to the FDA. So on the one hand, we're talking about food additive amendments, color additive amendments, drug residue from animals, and pesticide regulation. We can include in that some irradiation regulations as well. But in general, what we're looking at is what is a food additive, when are we adding something, and what regulation may apply. If it imparts color, we have one set. If it imparts, for some other reason, food, taste, some texture, some other element there, we have another. And these elements of the food additive amendments are going to apply both to FDA and USDA. So for example, if we do a generally recognized as safe submission to the FDA, we would include in there whether or not we're going to use that additive for products that would be under FSIS jurisdiction. And if so, the FDA would review, then FSIS would review and have any additional comments. So it's one of those unique places where we can see the legislation flowing through both agencies rather than the legislation applying only to one. And the legislation only applying to one would be an example of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was enacted in 2011, really the first substantive amendment we've had since the 1938 Act, exclusively for the FDA, and that can be some issues that we talk about. At its core, the Food Safety Modernization Act is about 7 foundational rules and about some new powers, some new teeth that the FDA gained in being able to enforce some of the provisions that were already existing, like the adulteration and misbranding provisions. One of the key examples of that is the ability to finally force a mandatory recall. We haven't yet seen that be used, but one time, the FDA in general will give you a heads up to say we're about to do it, and most companies at that point will do it. There's been one instance where a company said, we're not going to take that, you have to force us. And before, the FDA would have to go to court, get a judge to put an order in place, and get that recall moving in that way, which obviously can take much more time than the agency just mandating it on its own. So we have 2 key questions that we're dealing with this week because we are dealing with so many updates to the legislation, some much older than others. But in general, when we get to a food additive question, we're basically looking to see, is there some way that the adulteration provisions don't apply? We're not adulterated because we're an additive amendment, but we have a food additive petition, or we're grandfathered in under some existing regulation that occurred at the time of the passage of the amendments. If not, we're saying, well, we're not adulterated because we're added, but we filed a GROS submission, or we have a self-affirmed GROS. So we're going through that analysis to say, is it an additive? Does it have an existing status? If it doesn't, have we completed some step that was required? A little different, much more complicated analysis under the Food Safety Modernization Act. The textbook does try to get into that as detailed as possible. I think there's maybe 60 pages alone on FSMA. No way we can cover that all in one discussion. But in general, what we're trying to say is if we look at the Food Safety Modernization Act and we take the 7 foundational rules, what rule pertains to our activities, and we do that activity by activity. So if we're importing, we may analyze and say this rule applies. If we're manufacturing, we may analyze and say this rule applies. It's very detailed. It's very definitionally drawn. So if you followed my analysis before about what is food, intended use, and going through that sort of exercise, then this will be easy because we're doing a similar analysis here to say, for example, what is a farm, primary, secondary, and going through an analysis to determine whether we're in or we're out of some of these regulations or modified or full requirements, and very detailed in that way. So we're going to get into some of that into the audio lecture, and I'll join you there.